Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Folks, this is your host, Pat Flynn. Welcome back to the I Thought You'd Like to Know show. We are joined again by longtime friend of mine, Christian apologist, writer, man of many talents, Big Pete Groehler himself. Pete, thanks for taking the time to join me for another, what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, so, we were bouncing some ideas back and forth of what we wanted to talk on. And as soon as we do that, we kind of just end up talking about all those things anyways. And we're like, oh, okay, well, why don't we just get on air and rock and roll? So we were talking, a couple different things. One is, what is the Catholic or Christian perspective on all the various forms of popular music, especially heavy metal? Because I know, Pete, we go way back in that scene. We talked about the problems of religious pluralism and pantheism. So we have a lot of potential material to work through today. Will we be able to get through it all? Who knows? But why don't we start with that music question first? And I know this is something that you've thought a lot about. Maybe you've run into some kind of conflicting advice here as well, but you are quite a music fan, Pete. You're quite into heavy metal, but at the same time, you're a devout Catholic. Some people might think that these things are at odds, or that you can't enjoy one while practicing the other. Is that true? And if not, how do you reconcile the two?
Well, I mean, it's definitely a minefield that one has to go through, because there's all sorts of things that really go into that. I mean, we talked last time, I talked extensively on the idea of the fairy tale and literature as leading one into the world of philosophy. I mean, stories and music and art especially were created to answer the question of the divine and to transcend, so to speak, and make the philosophical pill that people need in their life to understand the world around them and what's going on beyond life. It makes that pill somewhat easier to swallow.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I'm a fan of what's called, quote unquote, extreme music, so to speak. And I guess the way I see it is it's an expression of the talents that God has given us, as well as, talking about a lot about, of course, that there's always that motif of, we're going to talk about the not so pleasurable things in life in this extreme kind of music.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, I feel it's an expression of talents and arguing for the points in life, trying to come through struggles and things like that.
Well, Pete, I think you bring up a very good point. As we know, some of the best art, I would argue the very best art of all time, was produced in the context of a very Christian society, oftentimes by the church itself, right? Mm-hmm. But now, in our modern age, we have, kind of the qualifier of the word Christian before certain types of art, right? Christian movies or Christian bands or this or that. And while some of these I think are very good and in many regards getting a lot better, I think they often just do not paint a very accurate picture of reality. They're a little too prettied up, so to speak. And, okay, there's something to be said about that, and certain things are more appropriate for other ages at certain times than others. But God did not give us a very prettied up world to live in right now, right? Like, there is evil and suffering in this world. So I think that these things can be depicted realistically and artistically, and I think they can be depicted in a way that points to the transcendent. And in fact, beauty is what we would call a transcendental, the good, the true, and the beautiful. So in this sense, I think we can all approximate and appreciate the glory of God through the beautiful. And the beautiful comes in countless forms. And it doesn't just come in the form of art that has the Christian qualifier in front of it. It certainly can come through that. But there is beauty in those passages, whether musical or motion picture, where we are brought into the more unpleasant aspects of life, because they're relatable. We all suffer through these things, and it helps to know that we're not suffering through those alone. And sometimes we see these just overly polished pictures of reality being painted either in song and music, and it's not relatable because that's not what we're experiencing. Now, of course, there's redemption, there's grace, there's all these other things. So while I very much appreciate the work of people who are out there putting forward outwardly Christian music or outwardly Christian motion pictures, I think there is still so much to appreciate and find beauty in, all of it giving glory to God either intentionally or not, through all the various art forms. So that would be my initial comments on it. Now, I think that we need to provide a few caveats and a few nuances, because I think certainly there are traps and snares that people can get caught into by engaging or following the wrong sorts of influences as well. So maybe that's worth discussing.
Right. Like I said at the outset, it's really a minefield if you really want to go through it. And I mean, obviously there's some bands out there that have incredibly Christian undertones. I know I grew up with a band called Creed, which talks a lot about Christian concepts. They have a song called Faceless Man, which talks about, a guy spending a day by the river in silence, and he comes across a faceless man, and he says, the face inside made me realize that I don't walk alone. And that is kind of that God undertone, so to speak. And, they were an incredibly popular band. I think they won, a couple Grammys. The band As I Lay Dying, Christian undertones as well. Albeit their singer did go to prison recently on some charges, but that being aside from that, and then you have to weigh that against bands like Deicide, which is openly anti-Christian in all respects. I guess where I would kind of point people that want to wade into this music and not really lose their faith is kind of do your homework. Like you've talked about the beautiful in all aspects. When you come in contact with something that transcends and something that is truly beautiful, your soul, I feel, knows what that's like and becomes attached to that. But I think, like, coming away from God, you talked about redemption as well. There is that, like, that anathema out there too that really takes it's kind of a slow chipping away, so to speak. So you really have to be careful.
Yeah, I'm glad you reminded me of the band Creed. It's been a minute since I've heard some. So I'm going to have to resuscitate them on iTunes. Yeah,
Mark Tremonti.
Yep,
is by far one of the most talented underground, lesser known, quote unquote, guitarists out there. So.
Yeah, and I remember they just dominated the airwaves in like the early 2000s. You could not hear Creed when you were getting in the car.
Right.
Yeah, man. Oh man, just bringing me down memory lane now, Pete. Bring me right down it. It's also, I think, important to realize that there's a lot of, and they're not always forward or outward about it, and maybe some of this is intentional, or maybe some of it is not. of a lot of musicians who you might not think of them as a Christian band, who are themselves Christians and quite devout Christians, Catholics, you know. And I think part of that, and I know some people in the music industry, they say, yeah, you know, they purposely don't want to use the term Christian rock or Christian band because it automatically kind of brackets them in a way that they don't want to be bracketed in. And I know some musicians that said that they feel that they could more effectively evangelize through their art by not putting, you know, labeling themselves as a Christian band. So, you know, I think that's kind of a prudential judgment there of, you know, the best way you think you can kind of maybe steer people. So I think maybe, you know, I haven't investigated into this or whatever, but, you know, who knows, maybe Creed is one of those bands where somebody who might not be a particularly Christian or spiritual started listening to them, started getting very into them. And who knows, maybe that helped guide them in some way to the faith or to the religion. Whereas that person would never have listened to a quote unquote Christian band, right? At least not an outwardly Christian band, because the defenses would have automatically gone up. Right. So I think there's something to be said there. I don't know exactly, you know, it's certainly not a right or wrong approach to it, but I think both are probably needed. Both are important. You kind of need that underhanded evangelization at times, right? Where it's okay, I'm going to give you the message that I think you need, but I'm not going to create any unnecessary barriers to entry to you listening to my music or watching my movie by giving it a label that you might have a whole bunch of stereotypes against. Does that make sense, Pete?
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Kind of that undercover quote unquote red pilling we were talking about,
mm-hmm.
with you know, slipping those messages in there. One of the bands that I really got into in high school especially is Tool. You know, they talk about, you know, the Fibonacci sequence in the song Lateralis, and you know, just the kind of what goes on in our brain. I think they have a perfect song that kind of sums up what we're experiencing here, and it's the song Vicarious.
Mm-hmm.
And the refrain says, "Vicariously I live while the whole world dies." And it's talking about, you know, experiencing and living life through, you know, the TV screen. The song starts out by saying, "I on the TV." Forgive me, I'm losing my train.
Yeah, I'm not enough of a Tool expert.
"I on the TV, tragedy thrills me, whatever flavor it happens to be like." You know, and I think, you know, especially with some of this art, it makes people think. You know, back in the Middle Ages especially, you go into the Louvre and you see beautiful paintings, like the scene in the Sistine Chapel is creationism and Adam and Eve, and just that perception and making people ask questions about their own reality, and making people ask questions about, you know, the inner workings of the brain, and how media affects us. You know, most people aren't gonna sit down and read a study about, you know, the effects of on the human brain from watching too much news, watching too much CNN, you know, which we've talked about privately together as having the possibility of mental illness. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of where I sit on it.
Yeah, I think you did a nice job at the start of kind of describing it as a minefield. You know, be careful in your approach is ultimately the message we're trying to get across. And, you know, as I'm raising kids, and I know how much joy the arts have brought me, but how in a number of ways that certain influences steered me in the wrong direction for a number of years. I don't want to restrict these joys that I had, but I also want to make sure that I'm able to carefully articulate how these things should be approached as my kids get older, as they're attracted to the arts, music, movies and cinema and so on and so forth. That's why this is an important discussion to be had. And so long as you have that foundation in faith, so long as you have that right orientation, you should be able to take out of it what is good, true, and beautiful, and reject those things that might be deleterious in some way. But ultimately, it comes down to that faith formation, to that basic understanding, which, because I didn't have that growing up, I was susceptible to other influences. But now that I do have that, I'm able to enjoy, even on a higher level, I would say at an even higher pitch, a lot of the music that I did enjoy growing up, and see how this is, of course, reflective of the divine, of pointing to the transcendent, that I find it all the more exquisite now, actually. So yeah, that's probably how I'll continue to approach it with my kids.
Right.
Indeed, Pete. So, the other thing I think we were talking about, not to switch gears too quickly here, but I think it's worth mentioning. Religious pluralism, pantheism. We were chatting about this a little bit earlier today. Why don't you say again what you said to me earlier that you found was kind of a funny, ironic tendency of our culture these days, of people kind of almost of this, like, helping themselves to this buffet of religion, kind of dabbling in all kinds of various religions, taking what they like from each and creating this almost grotesque amalgamation of beliefs and philosophies because of it, all in the name of, I don't know what, in the name of political correctness, maybe something. How would you describe this phenomenon, Pete?
Yeah, it certainly would echo towards the side of political correctness, and wanting to take all the good with none of the bad in a super sheltered kind of environment. What I likened it to in our private conversations, especially pantheism, some call it a religious pluralism, is, you look at a buffet, you say I want some of this, I want some of that, but I don't really like that, so I'm going to leave that alone. Kind of approach to religion. Yeah. Like, take Catholicism, for example, because we're talking in a Catholic light. I want to follow all of Catholicism, but, I don't like their stance on homosexuality, and I don't like their stance on, not using birth control. So I'm not going to follow along with that. And I think especially Matthew Kelly talks a lot about this in Rediscovering Catholicism, is you got to take it all or you got to take it not at all.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly true. And, I will say in my own reconversion experience, that was a commitment that I made. As soon as I realized that, okay, there is truth here. And whether I like it or not, I'm going to have to change my beliefs, because something is not necessarily true just because I believe it. Something is not necessarily good just because I desire. There are things that are really true that I should believe, and there are things that are really good that I should desire. So I had to go through an immense realignment process of many of my values and beliefs to come fully in line with what I have reason to really believe is good for me and is the truth. And I think part of the problem with this religious pluralism, and pantheism plays into it. So pantheism is this idea that, God is just everything. He just is the universe, right? That you are God and I am God. And it's very philosophically problematic and inconsistent on many levels. So we can talk about that if we get there. I don't think people really think the implications of pantheism through too fully. But religious pluralism, right? This is excuse me. I'm in New York right now. Allergies are just crazy. But, this idea of religious pluralism, that, all religions are true in a sense because they're all false, more or less, right? They're all pointing towards the same thing. So, take whatever you want from any religion. And I do think that this is a product of a culture that pushes this idea of political correctness or inclusivity for the sake of inclusivity. But the joke of inclusivity is it's exclusive of anybody who isn't a religious pluralist, which is the vast majority of people in the population, right? So it's by trying to be not offensive, you actually are potentially even more offensive, right? And that's what a lot of these people pushing this stuff don't get, is like, okay, you're trying to be inclusive of all religions, is saying all religions are equally valid. And you think that this is somehow not offensive, but it's greatly offensive, because most people are not religious pluralists. I think it's a growing ideology. I also think it's wrong. Most people are religious particularists. Particularists. That's a difficult word to say. Particularists. That's right. They think their religion is true. So trying to just be inclusive of all religions for the sake is really a self-defeating game. It's always going to be offensive. So, I'm much more interested in, what are your arguments? Why do you think religious pluralism is true or right? And just the argument that it's more inclusive is not going to fly with me. That's not a good, because I'm not sold on the idea of inclusivity just for the sake of inclusivity. I'm more interested in what is true, what is right, what is worth desiring, what is worth pursuing. And those are what I want to hear the arguments for. But no, I think the other reason people are attracted to it, aside from the political correctness appeal, is the appeal that it allows them to kind of build a religion around the way that they already are. Right, Pete?
Right.
So they don't have to change anything. They don't have to improve in any particular way. They can be like, you know what? I kind of like this about Christianity, so I'll take that. I kind of like this about Buddhism. I'll take that. I kind of like this about Hinduism. I'll take that. But I don't like this because that would make me change something. I don't like that. That would make me change something. So you kind of like patchwork some type of pseudo religion together, to make themselves, so they can be spiritual but not religious, and so they can give themselves that to kind of scratch that spiritual itch in a way without making any major changes or commitments. So I think when you kind of really dive down deeper into it, you can see why this approach would have appeal. But I think once you realize that, you can see why this approach would also be faulty.
Right. I mean, to credit Jordan Peterson, he talks about, the dominance hierarchy, and he talks about it in this regard. It says, the science exists. The science is the truth. So you either bend your values around the science, or you bend the science to fit your values. So I think what we're doing now is we're bending the science, quote unquote, or the religion around our own sick sense of selfish morality. And that really leads to chaos. I mean, we talked about too, finding rest and relief in God. Come to me, all you weary with your burdens and pain. Take my yoke on your shoulders and learn from me. And yeah, it's a sixth sense of things. We talked about the trappings within higher education last time. And I don't know if you've heard about this surging new quote unquote religion that they're pushing on college campuses. It's called Unitarian Universalism, which is exactly this kind of religious pluralism that we're talking about, which takes all the good, we can be spiritual in and of ourselves, go into delve even into Wiccanism, into, worship of the world around us, so to speak. And I had a professor, we talked about him last time, Dr. Duke Pesta, just eviscerate that feeling. If the earth is God, why is it so vulnerable? You cough in the wrong direction, you put a little bit more carbon into the atmosphere, you're killing off God, really? And just when we give validity to everything, is like you said, nothing's really valid anymore. And we've created such a culture, kind of to take a step back, is we've created such a culture that wants the end, the teleological end to all of these arguments without doing the work. And, Christ said in the Bible, if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to take up your cross and follow me. You have to do some work. There's some pain involved in this process of getting your soul prepared and receiving the grace to step into the heavenly kingdom at the end of your life. You can't just pick and choose what you want to follow and expect that you're going to get good results out of it.
Yeah, and this, the Unitarian Universalist is sort of a neo-paganism in some ways. Its rise, I think, is exactly for the reasons that we've just discussed, right? It's accessible, and we know that people have inherently a deep spiritual yearning. We everybody has this, right? This our soul's upward yearning. So people who reject the church or reject Christianity, most of them do not become hardcore atheists. Some of them do, but most of them, kind of become these vague spiritual but not religious types, and they start to dabble around, and many go to Eastern philosophies or things like this, and others become Unitarians or what have you. And I was in this camp myself for a while after my own particular atheist agnostic phase. So I know it well. I know it almost all too well. The problem, however, is if you think that objective truth can be had in this world, which I think Unitarians actually do believe that, then the more you search for it, the more you realize that all that truth starts to converge in Jesus. And the problem there is when you discover Jesus as he actually was, the true Jesus, not the liberalized spiritual guru Jesus that some people try to promote, but the actual Jesus, the one who really existed. The problem there is he shuts the door on religious pluralism. He shuts it hard and he keeps it shut. So, he's a radical. That's pretty offensive. Here's a guy who's saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now, he's inclusive in the sense that he wants everybody to come to him, but he has created a very narrow entry point. He has said that there is a true religion, and that true religion is found in him. And what is Christianity? It's practicing religion the way that God wants us to practice it, right? So people are like, well, why do I need religion? Can't I just be spiritual? Well, it's like, okay, well, if you believe in God, shouldn't you perhaps take it into consider that there's a way that God wants you to practice spirituality? And then if you just kind of dig into that a little bit and you come to Christ and you see that Christ really was who he claimed to be, then you realize there's a way that he wants you to practice your spirituality, hence the Christian religion. So, this was the alarming turning point for me, was coming to that, seeing the historical evidence that supported the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, realizing that this evidence was overwhelmingly obvious, that there was simply no good naturalistic explanation that could explain these facts, the appearances or the belief of the appearances to the apostles, the origin of the Christian belief. There's just no way that you can even remotely make sense of that aside from a supernatural explanation, that the resurrection actually occurred. But as soon as you accept that, divine authentication of Jesus, then you also have to accept that he was who he said he was. But as soon as you accept that Jesus was the Son of God, you have to also accept all the things that he taught and said and passed on, which again, it shuts so long as the case for Christ can be made, the door is firmly shut on this neo-paganism, religious pluralism. They just cannot be true. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't some truth in other religions. They're not necessarily wrong all the way through, but it does mean that there is one religion that has the fullness of truth, and that is, of course, obviously, we would say and argue Christianity.
Yeah, I think you made some good points there. I'm kind of struggling where to start with my answer to that.
We kind of packed a lot in, and I think this is something a lot of Christians and Catholics can struggle with, is you hear this rise on religious pluralism, and people are sometimes very easy to want to give into this because they feel like it's less offensive or this or that. Look, and no matter what, as soon as you this is what you have to realize, right? And this is not just true for religion. This is something everybody has to realize. As soon as you take a stance on anything, you are going to offend somebody. So you have to get over offending people and start worrying about talking about what is actually true, right? If you say the earth is round, people are going to be offended by that. This is why the idea of political correctness is dangerous. It values this, this pseudo-philosophical twaddle of inclusivity, which is exclusive of truth and human progress and God's plan for us. It is a dangerous, I'm convinced, Pete, that this thing is a true snare of the devil. Now, right. I have to nuance what I say, because I don't mean like go out and be a jerk and be rude to people. Obviously, you always want to present the message in the most gracious way that you can. You want to go through extraordinary measures and steps to make sure that when you speak the truth, you are doing it in a way that is going to be attractive to people, not repulsive. But you have to understand that just trying to not offend people is a losing game. It's a losing game individually. It's a losing game for humanity. If truth is to be had, which it is, and you're going to seek the truth and you're going to speak the truth, people are going to be offended. Again, any position you want to take, say this again. I like, it is true. If you go out and you say that the earth is round to enough people, you will eventually deeply offend somebody, right? You will. So why should this? And most people would say, well, that's silly. We should just still continue to say the earth is round. Of course, because it's true from everything we know. We have very good reason to believe the earth is round, just as we have very good reason to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So why should we accept that it's okay to promote one offense because it's true, but not another because it's true?
Right. Well, if you look at even the life of Jesus, like we were talking about, Jesus himself was Mr. Politically Incorrect. I mean, when in his final hours before his passion, he was pulled in front of the high priest, and they said, "How dare you say that you were going to pull down the Temple of Solomon and rebuild it in 3 days, the symbol of our faith, the very presence of the Lord God and the Holy of Holies. You would tear that down, Jesus, and rebuild it in 3 days? How dare you say that? And how dare you defend the prostitute that they were going to stone in the streets by saying, 'Let ye without sin cast the first stone'?" And to be Catholic, especially in today's world, and to be a Christian, you should be offended yourself, thinking that, you can't have this watered down version of what you want in this religious pluralism, and even being, a Sunday morning Catholic, so to speak, and, going to church, standing up, sitting down, kneeling down, hearing the word for an hour and going home. That's not what the world needs right now.
No, I think we could find inspiration with the early Christians as well. Again, as being pioneers of whatever the opposite of political correctness is, purveyors of truth, let's say. Rome back in its day was something of similar in some ways to our society now as far as religions goes. To them, like the more gods, the merrier, right? They were quote unquote tolerant of all religions so long as the religions were tolerable. But Christianity wasn't tolerable because it claimed to be particular, that it was the true religion. And of course, they found great offense in this, as was shown by the persecution of Christians there for quite some time. So if they, the fathers of the church, were willing to go out and proclaim the truth, and they were not only concerned about possibly offending people, which they certainly did. Obviously, their utmost concern was converting people. And again, I have to keep saying this: the goal is not to go out and offend people. That is the opposite of what we want to do. We want to win. We want to win hearts, not arguments. Right? Always want to win hearts, not arguments. But they weren't concerned about offending people. They knew they would offend people. And they also weren't concerned about getting their heads lopped off, because they knew the truth so deeply. They were so deeply convicted of it. So, that often gives me inspiration Think back to those times, but then back to the religious pluralism thing, especially the Unitarians, because I think that they, as far as scripture and things goes, that they just like allow everything in, which is to me is absurd because many of the world's religions, if not all of them to some degree, are mutually contradictory, right? If one is true, the other simply cannot be true, right? If either God is Unitarian or he is Trinitarian, right? This is the law of contradiction. Either Jesus was a son of God or he was not, right? You're forced with these logical dilemmas where it cannot all be true. It violates the law of contradiction. So everybody's just kind of jumbling around like 20 to 40 different contradictory philosophies in their head at all times. No wonder people are so confused. We have to be willing to pursue truth, to grind questions into the ground, just to intellectual pulp, and then we'll maybe be able to make sense of the world. But the way it's going with political correctness, it is leaving people confused, spiritually desolate in many ways. I see it as something that is not only pernicious, but something we must actively and aggressively battle against. Again, always charitably, always with kindness, but we cannot be timid about going out there and battling against this. Their arguments are not very good, I assure you. If you equip yourself with just some basic apologetic tools around Christianity and Catholicism, you can cut through this stuff very easily. So I hope that we've empowered some of that already in this conversation, because people are worried about atheism on the rise. It's not so much a concern, but religious pluralism definitely is this kind of new age spirituality where, hey, all religions are just saying the same thing, right? Well, that couldn't, the only person who believes that is anybody who's never studied any series of major religions. They are most definitely not saying the same thing, not even close. Right. People could be a little more sophisticated and say maybe they're all pointing toward the same thing. But as soon as anybody says that all religions are just saying the same thing, give me a break. You have not even taken a 5-minute cursory inspection on Wikipedia of the world's various religions will clearly tell you that they are not saying the same thing.
Right. I mean, even if we take just a small sliver of an example of that, before Jesus came around, you got all of the Isaiah, all of the prophets saying, the Lord God is coming. Behold, arise, shine, a light shines in the wilderness. Make straight a highway for God. God will come and deliver you from your bondage. And they said, oh, yay, great, we're getting a warlord. Is going to come riding on his white horse out of the east and deliver us from the Romans, which have been occupying our land now for a couple of 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're shocked when they get Jesus, and he said, and someone asked Jesus, Lord, what of our enemies? They're all around us. He said, essentially to turn the other cheek, do good to those who persecute you. And I'm just imagining, the apostles looking around, the crowd that had gathered, and people's mouths hanging open, and people kind of looking around like, well, Isaiah said, he would deliver us from our bondage, and how is this delivering it from our bondage? But going back to, especially the religious pluralisms and everything is valid, is how do you weigh that against a religion such as the Norwegian pagan religions of Thor and Odin and Loki and the warlords dining in Valhalla with those that die, valiantly defeating their enemies in battle.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you, and this may offend some people, but how do you also defend the Islamic principle of ridding yourself of attachments to the infidel while you yourself are validating the ways of the infidels? So it's a non-starter from the beginning, much like we talked about relativism the last time. And it's hard to have a ontological end to a religion that pulls you in so many different directions as Unitarian Universalism.
I think this is, not only do we have arguments to think that something is true, but we should also see how something fits with the greater picture. C.S. Lewis was great with this when it came to Christianity and showing that, Christianity is the only religion that completely and adequately answers the four major questions in life, right? Meaning, origin, morality, and destiny. Nothing else answers these four questions as well and in such a satisfying way as Christ. So that is kind of the utility or the pragmatic aspect of it. But even independently from that, I think this is why the discipline and the study of natural theology is so useful. As you know, Pete, we're working on some projects together, and one of them is kind of developing a minimum effective apologetic for Christianity. And the idea there is forget about all the quibbles that constantly go on around the Christian, kind of mere Christianity, let's say, not even getting into Catholicism at this point. Evolution versus creation, was Noah's Ark actually a thing? So whatever. All those things are, in my mind, completely irrelevant until you have first answered two very more fundamental questions. Does God exist? And is Jesus God? If you can answer those two questions in the affirmative, you have all the grounds you need for not only becoming a Christian, but for wanting to be. And then everything else that was a holdup before or that you're curious about, those can and should be answered. But they can and should be answered as a Christian, which is a major difference. So the idea, here is the study of natural theology is useful because it helps you to discern not only the existence of God, but what God is like. So when you understand the argument from contingency or the ontological argument or the unmoved mover argument or the moral argument, these help you to really understand who God is and what he is like. All-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, one, right? So it narrows it down. You cannot have a plurality of gods in a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful entity, right? To have more than one would require some type of differentiating feature, physical parts, spatial location, all of which God is not, which we can deduce. So natural theology, if nothing else, helps us to kind of remove away all the concepts and therefore all the religions that just cannot and do not represent an accurate picture of God. It can pull us out of pantheism. It can pull us out of polytheism. And natural theology done well, and this is what helped me to revert to the Christian religion and Catholicism, will bring you right up and right into monotheism. And then the question you have to answer there is there any such religion that claims that God did anything so spectacular as actually come to earth and do stuff and tell and say things when he was here? Well, it just so happens that there is. It's called Christianity. And then you just have to answer the question, okay, did Jesus actually claim to be the Son of God? And if so, was he who he claimed to be? And then this is where you can construct the historical case for the resurrection. And again, I think both of these answers can be answered in the affirmative with far more plausibility than any of their potential negations. And once you have done that, you're a Christian. You should be a Christian, right? Then we can answer everything else with that. This is how you defeat pluralism, get out of pantheism, whatever. It's not that difficult of a task to do. You do not have to have a PhD in philosophy to do it. The arguments are accessible to virtually anybody with a little bit of time, study, interest, and objectivity. You can find them. You can engage in them. So I just want to encourage everybody to take these arguments on, to understand them, to realize that the Christian religion is intellectually, you can investigate it intellectually and historically. That's the great thing about Christianity, is that it stakes everything on a claim, on a historical claim that somebody came to earth, claimed to be the Son of God, got himself killed, and then came back to life again. And so long as and if anybody could ever prove that didn't happen, right, then the religion is a sham. This is, of course, what St. Paul said in his letters. If Christ didn't rise, then all this is just a big joke. Our preaching is in vain. That's what makes the Christian religion so spectacular, but also so peculiar, is it stakes itself on a miracle. You cannot separate Christianity from miracles, and the miracle that it stakes itself on is eminently testable. The evidence is there for anybody who's willing to look into it. But the problem that I've seen, Pete, is people either don't realize the evidence is there or they're not willing to look into it.
Right. I think part of that has to do with, the PC culture that we're living in right now, and people not wanting to do the work and not wanting to seek the truth and blindly following, so to speak. All the evidence is there. And what a great promise that God has given us through the worship of his son and him all together. The mysteries of the resurrection. I'm going to live forever in the kingdom of God if I follow his laws. What a great promise at the end. The promise of God's mercy and forgiveness in Catholicism is something that, at least drew me back. All of the things I have done up to this point, and however far I've fallen away, God has promised that he'll take me back into his loving arms. One of my favorite pictures, my mother has it in our house, is presumably of a young man that has gone to heaven, and Jesus is embracing him like it's his best friend. And what a great testament to the faith. And we talked about last time, faith is believing in something that you have good reason to believe in. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the expansion of the universe and how infinitesimally, there's me struggling with words.
Yeah, there's another.
How everything is so infinitesimally in order that chance is almost a mute argument at this point for the way things are put together and the way things are together. And, you posted on Facebook a lot of people essentially taking things and treating them as a religion. You talked a lot about fitness, counting carbs and, what should I put into my body? And essentially the body is a temple argument, but it's my own temple of my own making, and I can hewn out of it what I want. And I talked about, going through the death of my brother, especially from his heroin addiction, as turning me back to the faith. And, we find so many things in the fantastical now, I called it in my response to your post. We find so many things to keep us busy and so many little distractions that are so utterly meaningless. And we talked about music at the outset. When you get that new CD or you download that new album, you play it and you play it and you play it and you play it and you love it for a while, but then it starts to run out. You pull it out, you throw it in your CD case, and it collects dust for the next 15 years while you move on to the next best thing. And then I talked about, my mother picked the music for my brother's funeral, and one of, my favorite hymns that I'd never really taken seriously before it's the hymn "Be Not Afraid." And the refrain says, "Be not afraid, I go before you always. Come follow me and I will give you rest." And humanity is on such a course, where we look to things like sex and, good food and good movies, the Netflix and chill generation, for trying to get us to that sense of happiness that, I talked briefly in our last conversation about, we're all just boats on the sea capsizing in the waves. When I think it was the Apostle Peter was cast out of the boat, when he was with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, and the apostles are caught in a storm, and Peter is cast out on the boat, and he reaches out to Jesus, and he says, "Lord, help me." And Jesus pulls him back in the boat, and he says, "Oh, ye of little faith, did you not think that your Father would provide for you?" And that's kind of echoing nowadays, like I said, with the people that are trying to find substance, trying to find meaning in the things of the world, and trying to find a meaning in life while dealing with the trappings of atheism, the trappings of pantheism and pluralistic religion. And, who knew there'd be such a simple solution?
Well, and part of the second part of the kind of minimum effective apologetic, right, is once you see that you have good reasons that Christianity is true, then we can consider the motivational side. And that is, and I would argue, everybody should want Christianity to be true. Now, just because you want something to be true doesn't mean that it is. So you need to study the arguments for its actual truth. But once you've done that and see that, oh wow, they're quite good, then you can think about it. Okay, is this something I should want to be true? And Christianity, properly understood, I mean, could you even imagine a more magnificent scenario than this, right? Like, are you telling me that you'd rather reincarnation be true, that you have the chance of coming back as a corn snake rather than going to heaven? Are you telling me that's right? Like, give me a break. And certainly not atheism. Of course, the vast majority of atheists, don't contemplate on the consequences of what is ultimately their religion, their highest commitment, which is trying to ignore the existence of God, which would be nihilism. Nobody wants that to be true. That's absurd. Who wouldn't want to spend an eternity with those that they love and cherish more than anything in communion with God? Who wouldn't want that? And who wouldn't be willing to make certain potentially uncomfortable adjustments here and now in a finite temporal sense for an eternity of joy? Who wouldn't want that? You would have to be so insincere to say that you wouldn't want that. You would have to be a complete misanthrope of some degree. And if you are, that's fine. There's a place for you too in Christianity as well. And I got to play that. But I think that's a side that people don't really see. And part of it comes down to the misunderstandings and the misconceptions that constantly surround Christianity and Catholicism, seeing it as some type of arbitrary set of rules and not seeing what it really is: a religion of redemption, a religion of saving that gives us that complete satisfying answer to meaning, origin, morality, and destiny. I just do not, when people understand what Christianity is, I do not believe that anybody who says that they wouldn't want it to be true. But I do believe certain people who will say it sounds too good to be true, I thought that myself, but but that's how good it really is. And but then when you understand the nature of God, the ontological argument that God is the highest conceivable being, he's morally perfect. Well, a highest conceivable being that's morally perfect, of course, a being that is worthy of worship, would want the greatest conceivable joy for those that he loves. And if he loves us, which God does, of course he wants the highest conceivable joy for us. It would follow logically and necessarily that it should be too good to be true, that heaven must come out of the proper conception of God necessarily. It cannot be anything else than that. Now, it doesn't mean that because we have free will and that we've turned away from God, that certain evils and sufferings aren't permitted now to achieve that greater joy, to shape us to be able to come into that greatest conceivable communion and joy with God. That actually makes perfect sense. But in the end, not only should Christianity seem too good to be true, but in order to be consistent with the very conception of God, it would almost have to be.
Right. Well, what a great thing to not fear what ultimately every animal and everything comes to fear, which is death. I'm going to be in God's kingdom after I die, and I want to bring something up here.
Mm-hmm. Doing a little research on the fly here, Pete.
Yes.
That's good. Yeah, we don't have any like full-time fact checkers on this show yet, but I encourage it.
Not yet. I'm not being handed by stats like Bob Euchre on the air. I wanted to look up this line from Measure for Measure by Shakespeare, because I'm horrible at quoting. Actually, when we talked last time, I talked about the character of Shylock being in Measure for Measure, and that's actually Merchant of Venice, so I wanted to get it right this time.
Sure. Yeah, the fact checkers call you out on that one, Pete.
A little bit.
Keep us honest, folks. Keep us honest.
That's right.
We value truth here. If we are in any way in error, we always want to hear about it. We promise we will not be offended, or if we are, we can take it.
Right. Well, in the play Measure for Measure, the Duke takes a character called Claudio into custody because he feels that Claudio is a little bit of a ruffian, so to speak, and he's kind of a naysayer and wants to kind of put the fear of God back in him before he marries his sister Isabella.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes to Claudio and says, be steadfast for death. So because he's going to kill him in 3 days or something like that. And he says, be steadfast for death. So whether I kill you or you live is ever the sweeter, so to speak. And then Claudio comes back and says, yes, but to die and go who knows where, to lie cold and congealing and to rot, this consciousness warm body to become a compact lump of the earth, and the vast spirit to swim in hell's fiery floods, or reside in a frigid land of thick ice, Dante reference, to be confined inside invisible winds and perpetually violently blown all around the world, hanging in space, or to be worse off than one of those tortured souls howling from punishment of sinful thoughts. Oh, it's too horrible. The weariest, most hateful life that old age, aches, poverty, and imprisonment can inflict on us is paradise compared to our fears of death. Yeah, like he said, flipping his own argument on him, what is life is but a breath, like we said last time, going back to the Peter Pan argument, Captain Hook is constantly chased around by that crocodile that is fed the clock. He constantly hears that ticking. You remember, I think it was Dustin Hoffman played that character in Hook, and he's literally smashing all the clocks around him because he's so envious of the Lost Boys and Peter for not getting old, and Peter comes to his realization that death is a possibility for him. Captain Hook will kill him if he gets his hands on him.
Yep.
And they're sword fighting at the end, and Peter's laughing at him, and Hook says, "Do you not fear death, Peter? With one blow I could strike you down, and that would be the end of you." And Peter says, "Death would be but the last great adventure." And reconciling our own mortality, I think, is a huge part of that, and Christianity has that answer.
Yes, and it offers a better answer to that than any other religion, and I will extend that challenge anytime, any day. But it is a challenge we will have to take next time. Pete, as always, we could jam on this all day, all night, but we've come up to our time here, so we're going to have to.
I'm glad I got my literary reference right this time.
No better way to end, so far as I'm concerned. So, Pete, I know you've got a lot of things in the works. We've got a few things that we're working on together, but for people who want to kind of, maybe get connected with you now, follow up with what you're doing, where's the best place to do that? Facebook?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook. I'm always kind of putzing around, and we have arguments together, and I have arguments elsewhere. You can find me on Facebook, Peter. I'll spell my last name, Groehler. Like I said, I have some things in the works. I'm going to be starting a podcast here soon called The Right Side of Things.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys like my opinion, like I said, that's still in the works. I'm be sure to let Pat know when that gets up and running for those of you that are interested.
Pete, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me.
All right, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.